There are so many books in the world that want to teach you about writing. Some focus on the turn of phrase and the word craft that fills your books, and that's an important focus to be sure, but writing in a pleasant way does not solely make a good novel. Other books want to guide you through the twists and the turns of creating a story. They may want to help you bring realistic characters to life, or they want to show you how to make your setting one that is fully realized. Other books turn the lens around and point directly at the author. The tips and guidance of these books are not related to how or what you write, but why you write. They want you to lead a better life and one that is filled with writing, not a life where writing is just a marketable skill. They point to a life that has meaning, and the words you write are the ways to express that gratitude. I scoured the internet to find what writing books were the most praised, and I selected 3 books that I found mentioned the most often. And I read them, so that you don't have to, even though you really should. Watch to the end to get to see the biggest lessons that I learned from these books. Like and subscribe for more writing content like this, and there are links to all of these books in the description to support this channel at no extra cost to you. And if you think I missed any great writing books, then drop them in the comments below. First, we have the big one, the book on writing that everyone recommends first, Stephen King's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. This book is half memoir and half writing advice, and it's likely the first book that you find when you're looking up writing books. You may find the idea of a half memoir, half writing advice book to be a strange one, but I'm begging you, do not skip this book, or any of the books on this list, and here's why. Each of these books provides you actionable takeaways. Things like how vocabulary is the bread of writing, and how verbose purple language can be beautiful to read, but simple writing can be just as impactful. No, the most important things in these books are not those takeaways, but the inspiration that they impart in you. You read these books to learn to write, but you also read them because they inspire you to write. They make you want to dive back into your draft and apply these new skills with this new passion. So as we break these books down, please don't think you can just skip these books because you're such a great writer. Realize that these books can be used as a shortcut to get you back into your routine of writing, because we all fall out of that routine sometimes. So let's unpack Stephen King's book. This is like the Spark Notes version. It takes about half of the book to get through the memoir section, which is a good read, and into the toolbox, as he calls it. These are the lessons that he wants to impart to you about writing. King writes about his life growing up and his desire to write and the failures that he's had. It's kind of comforting to know that the challenges that you face as a writer are shared by one of the all-time greats. He gets discouraged at his own writing, he gets a great idea and he writes 4 pages of a draft and then he loses momentum. He hits brick walls, he throws drafts away. Once we get past the memoir and are thoroughly inspired by his story, King starts to put out some killer writing advice. And let's start where it makes the most sense, at the beginning of the writing process. King chimes in immediately with a piece of advice that I've been mulling over for years. If you want to be a writer, you must read. What do you think about this? Do you agree or disagree? Comment below. Now, his big point here is that by reading, you are subconsciously analyzing these stories even if you aren't meaning to. You're marking what works and what doesn't in the books that you've read. You're noting what was a satisfying plot point or piece of character development, and maybe most importantly, you're noting what didn't work. They say good writing is invisible, and I say you learn the most about how to write better, or to tell better stories, by experiencing something that wasn't done very well, because it was so visible. Now, how does Stephen King come up with ideas? Inspiration can come from anywhere, but it's usually a combination of different, seemingly unrelated ideas. Carrie was written from a moment of inspiration on teen cruelty and telekinesis, 2 articles that he read from a Life magazine. But the draft that he wrote following that moment of inspiration, he quickly threw away. He had a couple issues with his work. Least importantly, he says, he wasn't emotionally invested in the story. Second, he didn't care about the lead character. Third, he didn't feel comfortable with what he was writing. He had a full cast of teenage girls and he didn't know if he was writing them well enough. And lastly, the story idea that he had was originally meant for a short story, and he realized that this story would only work if it was much longer. The famous story with Stephen King is that he threw away his draft of Carrie into the trash, and his wife later picked up that draft, brushed off the cigarette ashes, and read it. and she asked him to finish it because she saw the promise of the story. And maybe the best thing about the story is how she phrased it. She wanted to see what happened to the characters. And that is some of the highest praise you could get as a writer. All right, so you have an idea. How does Stephen King suggest that you get to writing? Well, first you decide on what story to write, and then your first draft should be written as if you are telling yourself the story. You write to get that story down. You don't worry about if an editor or an agent would like it. This first draft is the hardest part of writing. It takes a lot of dedication to write a full story, tens or even hundreds of hours of work. And only after you get that first draft down, then you should make it for other people. You edit the story to make sure that others will enjoy it. But first, just get the story down for yourself. King says writing a story consists of three main parts. Narration moves the story. Description creates a reality for the reader, and dialogue brings the characters to life. Now, King is a notorious pantser. He says that he rarely plots things out, and he chooses to find the story instead. But we aren't all Stephen King, so outline if you feel like you need to. Now, I've always considered setting, plot, and character as the most important parts of a story. Since I've started here on YouTube, many people have informed me that they think that theme is the most important part of your story. King here believes that you should start planning a story first and then find and explore a theme later. More on that in a bit. In my opinion, one of the greatest pieces of advice that he gives in this whole book is how he decides what to write. Not what story to write, but how to write that story down. He proposes something called the ideal reader as sort of a guiding star. He believes that every story is written for an ideal individual person, that there is someone out there who would find this story to be the perfect story. That is the ideal reader. When you get stuck and you wonder what to do next, you can ask, what would the ideal reader want to happen next? What does that ideal reader want for pacing? Do they want a breakneck action story or a slow burn that unravels over 1,000 pages? It's almost like a magic 8-ball for writing, right? You can ask whatever question you want and then dream up of some answer. Now for some great writing advice after you get past that draft. You've got a story down. A lot of people have been commenting on my videos about how to revise or edit a draft, and I found King's advice here to be really valuable. A piece of feedback that he once got provided a formula. The second draft should equal the first draft minus 10%. And if you're telling yourself that you can't cut 10% of your story, then you aren't trying hard enough. Before you do this kind of cutting down of your draft, take a break. Step away from your manuscript. King recommends like 6 weeks. And then come back and read your story in as few sittings as possible. This break from your story will help you come back refreshed and ready to experience your story anew. And you'll recognize bits and pieces, but you'll also more easily be able to see things like plot holes or weird character decisions. Don't see this as like a dreadful experience. This should be exhilarating. You're experiencing your own creation, your own story. Feel proud of what you wrote and don't be discouraged by stupid mistakes. Tackle those spelling errors, those pesky grammar mistakes, and then, you remember that theme we talked about before? Now that we have the story, we can start to push it towards the appropriate theme, and maybe more importantly, cut out things that go against that theme. Stephen King has a great way of writing, and that extends to this book. I'm giving you sort of the Spark Notes version of his writing advice, but if you read through this book, it just makes so much sense. Reading this book will have you running to your laptop afterwards and locking yourself in a room to write. It just has that effect on writers, whether you've read it 1 time or a dozen times. Pick this book up below. The second book on my list is Jessica Brody's Save the Cat Writes a Novel, the last book on novel writing that you'll ever need. I'll be the judge of that, Jessica. For those who are unaware, Save the Cat is a really useful plot framework that originated in screenwriting. It's a series of plot beats, similar to what you would find in like the hero's journey or the 8-point story arc. More on those concepts in this video. But it also pairs it up with page numbers and progress percentages. It's really useful if you want to plan your story out with the correct pacing. And if you find King's advice too abstract and you want something more direct, then the Save the Cat book is certainly more direct. Now, hot take, I don't think a writing advice book needs to be 300 pages long. And any book that claims to be writing advice and is 300 pages is full of unnecessary fluff. And this is one of those books, unfortunately. The first breakdown here is the framework, which Jessica Brody does not bury the lead. Right away, we get a breakdown of every plot beat. This plot is broken into 3 acts, 6 sections, and 15 beats. You can figure out how long each act, section, or beat should be based on your overall word goal. Now, this plot framework is just another way to plan your story. It may work for you, it may not. It's not like you don't have options, but I do think it is worth a try. The Save the Cat is a plot framework that I use pretty frequently. But this book as a whole is really just trying to sell you on this idea. After explaining the Save the Cat structure, the book spends 200 plus pages explaining how different genres of stories can fit into this structure by using examples. And that's great if you're all in on Save the Cat, but it's less great if you are just writing one genre. The other 7 genres explored in the book just aren't as applicable. The book ends with a helpful section that discusses how you can use note cards to plot to this framework and how it could look if you lay them all out on a desk, and how to section the note cards in different areas. All in all, I found this book to be more of a sales pitch than a true writing book. There were a few tips regarding the craft of writing, and instead it was just more exploration into how you could use this plot framework. The good news is that if you really connect with Save the Cat, then you have 300 pages of material here to explore. Plenty of this can be found online before you commit to a book like this. If you feel comfortable in your ability to write, and you just need a more structured way to plan your story out, then pick it up below. Our last book today is more similar to King's book than to the Save the Cat book. This is Bird by Anne Lamott. And Anne Lamott wastes no time in getting to the writing advice, and it is presented in such a nice way. Stephen King was focused more on life than writing, providing good advice but in a less structured way than this book. Save the Cat focused only on one aspect of writing, the plot framework. This book, on the other hand, is completely focused on every aspect of the writing process. Part 1 of the book focuses on advice for writing, and Part 2 focuses on being a writer. 2 different things, I promise. So, to the writing advice. How do you get started? You try to sit down at the same time each day and write. You train yourself to enter that creative mode when you're able to write. And it's okay to have tough days where you don't make a lot of progress. Lamott really focuses on a point that I've taken to heart recently. Writing a book is a big endeavor, and lots of aspiring authors see writing a book as the only worthwhile pursuit when it comes to writing. They want to write a novel. They have plans for a fantasy epic or a space opera, and they want to start writing it right now. But that's not the only way to write, and it certainly isn't the best way to start writing. It's like looking at Mount Everest all the way to the peak, if you could see the peak, and saying, I'm going to climb that. And that can be intimidating. Lamott suggests to look at it differently. Change your perspective. You don't have to write a whole series. You don't even have to write a whole book. You just have to write the next scene. I encourage you to go one step further. Short assignments should also mean that you don't always have to write a book, especially for your first work. Put in the planning and the time and develop a novella or a short story, something with a beginning, middle, and end that lets you practice plot development, character development, pacing, all of that with a lower word count. Whatever you write, it's going to be a bad first draft, and that's okay. I talked about the importance of the proto draft in this video, which is an even worse draft than a bad first draft. Good books are edited books. In talking about plot and characters, Lamott starts with characters. She believes that once you have your characters and focusing on likable and reliable narrators, then you can create your plot. Now, Lamott is clearly someone who refrains from planning a story out. She likens her writing to watching a Polaroid develop. She lets her characters drive the story and lets their actions determine the plot instead of planning a plot independently and sort of corralling the characters into those decisions. Stark contrast to what we saw in the previous book. Now, it's possible to have the best of both worlds. Save the Cat can help you create the shape of your plot, and you can still be flexible enough to have your characters make different decisions. You don't have to pick one or the other. Now for Lamott, characters are clearly the focus. Her points continue with some that King made. She puts a lot of emphasis into how dialogue makes characters feel real and complicated. But how do you write good dialogue? This is a question I see a lot. Lamott reads her dialogue out loud as she writes, and she emphasizes on listening to conversations around you and training yourself to be able to repeat that sort of dialogue in your writing. Because character is so important, she thinks that each character should be identifiable by how they speak. Each character must have a self. Now, this was a mistake that I used to make in my early days of writing. I wanted my characters to be realistic, so I based them on parts of me, the person I knew best. Now, this meant that every character kind of reacted to the same things in the same ways. If I would react to something reasonably and logically, well, then so would my characters. And that is boring writing right there. You can avoid boring writing here. You have to create characters that have different lives and opinions and fears and trauma than you do. And these aspects of those characters mean that they'll react differently. And that's fun writing. Now, her chapter on dialogue is full of gems about how to turn your characters into realistic people. And it doesn't always happen in the first draft. If you don't love your character in that first draft, then you rewrite. Your characters may not start out as realistic in your first iteration, but through your drafts, you develop them into real people as you get to know them better. And this is why in my proto draft video, I talk about how I always write temporary beginnings. I know that by the time I get to the end of my draft, I'll know these characters in a completely different way. They'll have evolved, and I want to introduce them differently than I originally did because I understand them so much better. This book by Anne Lamott is like a letter from an old friend. Her style of writing is so unique and so charming. This is the kind of book that you bring to the park with you on a sunny day. It feels so at home with curling up in the warmth of the sun, swinging in a hammock, and just like laughing at her witty style of humor and absorbing and appreciating her beautiful writing. This book inspires me to write simply because I want to share that warmth with someone else. I know I can't write like she does, but it doesn't stop me from wanting to try. Look, pick up this book, read it, put it on the bookshelf, take it down whenever you need that shot of writing inspiration. Because you would have to be heartless to read through this book and not feel inspired. Pick it up below. There are so many books on writing, and these are just the 3 most commonly referenced books on writing that I've found. Am I missing any other great books? What's helped you out the most? Let me know down below and I'll do another video on those books and what actionable takeaways that they have. You can make sure to follow this channel for more writing videos, and as always, thank you for watching.